Well, I think apart from the major problem that many of us in here faces is that we don't have the knowledge of where to go and how to use the digital programs and softwares with our students. I keep thinking about the ethical problem as well, that I don't have the control as a teacher because I don't have that knowledge of how the students might interact in a negative way with another, with each other. And are you able to see any difficulties with the ethical aspects of using the digital technology in terms of us not being knowledgeable as teachers?
Okay. Yeah. What I would start out is by thinking about it from the perspective of saying, look, we're all learning. The modes of interaction that are evolving right now, we don't have experience with them because they're new. Okay, we have social interactions in other domains, but what you see, for instance, on Facebook, it's a completely new world. We're all learning at the same time. And it's true that as teachers, we don't come from the world that our students are coming into, right? They're born into it. If there's a question, there's been some very good research recently debunking the question of the millennials versus the rest of us, okay? There's nothing necessarily natural about it, but it is true that children who are coming into school today are taking a lot of these things for granted that for us were obviously not around when we were kids. But at the same time, I think that if anything, that stresses the ethical responsibility we have to work through with the students what ethical approaches to the use of the technology are. It's not going to happen naturally. Okay, a lot of people assume, well, they'll figure it out for themselves. It is not going to happen by itself. What that means is that we have to use the best tools that we have, that we've used in other media, for thinking about what's an ethical use of the medium with our ethical modes of interaction, and work alongside and with our students to talk about this. I'll give you one example of a tool that I like very much. There was a program back in the 70s that was Philosophy for Children, and several books were published with this. The idea was to introduce children at an early, young age to key notions of philosophy, particularly ethics in philosophy, but also some aspects of epistemology and so on, so that they could use these as elements in what they did in education, in their learning, and so on. I think we need something like that today. I think we need to be talking seriously about thinking about how do we think systematically through ethical problems and work through them in many contexts, which include those that are related to technology, which include those that are related to interaction, to ethical interaction, ethical creation. And I think we have a responsibility there as educators. So it's not an easy answer. There's nothing that I can say, well, just go and use this pre-made thing. I think we're all making this as we go along, but I think we have a responsibility to do so. Okay.
We have seen in one of the schools, or two of the schools that started first with the one-to-one concept, we have very positive effects on student motivation and so on. But one of the things that we see that worries me a bit is that we see that people say that both teachers and students say it's quieter in the classroom. It could be nice in a way, but we need to have verbal interaction, especially in Botkyrka, where we really need to develop our language or the students' languages. So there might be a risk that in the earlier stage here, you actually form practices that makes the classroom silent and doesn't have where you don't have the verbal interaction between the students or between the students and the teacher. And I wonder, from the experiences from Maine, where you've been working with this in a much larger scale, is that what you've seen in Maine as well, or do you get over this stage, or what are the experiences?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think what we've seen in Maine is we do see some of what you're describing, but in general we encourage people to get beyond that. In other words, the classroom that has fallen silent, if you will, and it's not the silence of busy interaction, but it's a silence because you're not having interactions is something you want to move away from. But for instance, one of the things I've seen, I was recently in Chicago for a conference, and I've been very interested in the work they've been doing there. And since you mentioned the early grades, right? I've been fascinated by some of the work that's being done using the iPad to bring children at young ages into more interaction rather than less. So again, it's a question of how you focus the work. If what you're doing, one of the things we tell teachers, we recommend that teachers not do, is to say, okay, everybody, you've got your laptop, okay, open and now quietly read on the laptop. That's not a good use of the technology. It's not a good use for science. It's a substitution use, but it's a substitution use that could be done anywhere. In other words, why are you using that valuable interaction time in the class to have students silently read something? That's time that they can do at home. That's time, save that for another space. But the space that's so valuable, that time that you have with your students, that they have with each other, think about how the activities involve more interaction, involve more dynamics. So if you find that your classroom is, as I say, silent, but not silent because everybody is busily working on something they're passionate about, that's fine. But silent because it's a passive activity with no interaction, I'd suggest that at that point you need to be taking a step back and rethinking how you're using the time of the classroom relative to the technology.
I talk in Swedish, he translate for me. Yes. Jag undrar lite hur vi som skolledare kan minska den stress som jag tycker sker hos många lärare, att det finns en förväntan både utifrån och på dem själva att man genast ska transformera sig till det som du definierar som steg 4. Och hur man kan få till en sund utveckling där.
Okay, I'll try and translate. The question is from a leadership perspective. How do we meet the feeling of the teachers or of the school that they're in a stressful situation, that we have to suddenly go from step 1 to step 4? How do we meet that worry?
Okay, there's 3 separate aspects that are going to be important here. The first one is one that I've already mentioned, but I want to stress it again. You don't have to do everything all at once. You don't have to go to redefinition in the first step or in the first year even. In other words, you need to have a plan for getting there, but it isn't something that needs to happen right away. And that's important. Just that, right off the bat, can take away a lot of the stress. Because you're saying, okay, I know what I know what I know how to do well. I also know that there's some things I need to learn. If I have a plan for developing to where I want to get, I can also develop my learning, my understanding as we go along. So that's important. But there are 2 more things that are also key components here. And one of them has to do with what I would say the permission to experiment. The permission to try things, and yes, the permission sometimes to fail. Because it's very important to realize you are not, nobody does, you are not going to get everything right off the bat. But that's okay. That's okay because when I've seen people do, deep, thoughtful development of their courses, even when something doesn't work out, they still are further ahead than they would have been had they not adopted things. So they may have something to fix. You may have to say, well, okay, I realize you didn't get this aspect of the course. We're going to have to pick it up next week. And that's fine. But everybody, from leadership to the teachers to students, needs to be comfortable with this notion. That say, this isn't something that you just go through the mechanics and everything turns out perfect the first time. You watch those cooking shows, and invariably that beautiful cake comes out of the oven. Now, if you've ever done any serious cooking, you know that your first cake sometimes looks great and sometimes not so much, but you learn from that. So these are what I call permissions. Okay? It's the permission to experiment and to understand that in the process of experimenting, of treading new paths, there is going to be some amount of failure. But again, there's responsible and irresponsible failure. Irresponsible failure is you didn't think about what you were doing, you rushed in, you made a mess of it. Okay, that's just because you're a bad planner, a bad designer, etc. But responsible failure is what happens when you try and experiment. Well, some aspects don't work out the way you expected them. For instance, in using social media tools, that's a perfect example. I've seen people who go in and say, I want my students to be using blogs, and they find that the interactions among students in the blogs don't quite work the way they expected, right? So, for instance, one thing I've learned, and I've learned this by virtue of working with people and having some of those experiments not work very well, is to say, well, you know, the best results we seem to get with blogs is to not try to have students comment on all the other blogs in the class, but to create both stable as well as rotating teams of commenters on each other's blogs in the class. And that's something we figured out, you know why or how? We figured out because we had everybody comment on everybody's blog, and after a while we found it sort of works, but there are some aspects that aren't working really well. By doing some more experimenting, we found this. But you have to have the permission to do that. And the third aspect, then, in addition to these two I mentioned before, that becomes really important in terms of dealing with that, is to have a leadership team that can support the professional development work, can provide the support for the planning, etc., that you're talking about here. And that's something that goes throughout the entire structure. It goes from the formal administration structures to teachers that assume the role of leaders in the institution, to having teams of teachers come together and talk with each other, discuss the development of their projects and so on. So it's a whole, it's not just one place. You know, some people say, well, leadership, and they just think whoever is the principal for the school. That's an important component. But it really has to permeate the entire structure, that different people assume different leadership roles throughout, and that those leadership roles are supportive of this process. Because again, you're going to be learning new things, well, that needs to be supported by these different structures, and each of the structures has a different role to play relative to that support. But if you don't have that support, then it's much more difficult. So that's the third component that I talk about, you know, creating a type of leadership culture that has multiple tiers, multiple structures throughout, but that throughout supports the necessary professional development, the necessary development time to have serious work done in this regard.
Sista fråga får det bli då.
I wonder, we have schools, classrooms, lectures that pretty much not have changed the last 100 years. Can we effectively redefine teaching and learning when we have environments that looks that was designed 100 years ago? And then when we say school, if we say school, let's say in 20 years, what do you expect to see?
All right, very good questions, both of them. Let's take the first one. In terms of what happens, you're right. If we could design different learning spaces, then certainly we could design spaces that are better adapted to the type of work we're talking about. However, I don't think we're going to get the budgets to go in and say we're going to completely redo our schools from top to bottom, not least because some of what we need to do is we need to experiment to figure out what those spaces are going to look like. So, are the spaces that we are working in ideally suited to some of the work we're doing? No, they're not. I'm not going to lie to you. But they can generally be adapted, modified. Again, it's a question of attitude. I'll give you a simple example from some of my own work. Okay, when I did some design work for a large-scale project, this is back in the 90s. And one of the things I found is I could not, because I was working on shared collective spaces where students were going to be doing media production in shared work, I found that the existing furniture, etc., was simply not suitable to it. So what I found out is that the place I was working at had stored these beautiful, large butcher block wood tables because they didn't have a major use. They had been used about 50 years before in the dining halls, but had never been used since. I found out about them and I said, give me those. I want them. And what we did is we adapted these large-scale butcher block tables to create large shared spaces where people could create, bring in the technology. Remember, these are days before we had Wi-Fi and so on, so we had to figure out how to navigate sharing parameters and so on. And we created spaces that were for that. And as I say, many things like this are things that we can adapt, start modifying the spaces, etc., as we go along. So they're not optimal. I would argue that we need more plastic spaces. I would argue we need more flexible spaces. You know, fixed chairs, for instance, is not a good way to go. I can point to specific configurations that tend to hinder student interactions when we're talking about intensive creative interactions with the technology. But we can work around them. In other words, I've yet to see the classroom that's so much of a barrier that you can't do anything with it. but do bring along your screwdriver to unbolt some parts and move things along. So the first thing is, they're not ideal, but we can adapt. And so that gets to your second question, which is what do I think is going to happen? I think one of the things that's going to happen is that we move further and further along in a direction where we start losing, or not losing, but certainly having a complete restructuring of what looks to be the formal structure of school. Learning becoming more permeated throughout the world structure and much less oriented towards you go here to learn and then you go home at the end of the day. I think we're going to see more flexibility in some of those structures. I think we're going to see more incorporation of the world around us into the domains in which learning occurs. I don't know how fast that's going to occur. Some of these structures are very, I don't know if resistant is the right word, but certainly take a long time to change. So I don't know if we're looking at 20 or 30 years out, but I do think we're seeing some of that now. I think we're seeing some of that now because, frankly, even regardless of what we do, you know, most kids out there have one of these or something that looks much like this. Okay, they either have a smartphone or a feature phone. And even the weakest feature phones these days already have incredible capabilities in terms of acting as gateways to knowledge. And the kids aren't waiting to use them for finding out about the world, for creating and so on. They may be looking at things that, you know, are not necessarily the things that we're doing in schools, etc., but they're already using them, they're already learning, they're already creating, they're already using the world as their space for learning and creation. And I think, frankly, that it's going to be a question of how we merge our objectives with that process and how quickly we can do it that will shape ultimately what schools look like as entities, both physical and conceptual, in the next 20 to 30 years. Thank you.